It was a cold, rainy Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, the kind of evening where the wet streets reflect the glow of the streetlights, like slick mirrors, and the wind whispers between buildings with a chill that seeps beneath coats and collars. Yet despite the weather, Aliyah Bennett, CEO of a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire, renowned philanthropist, and one of the few black women in the country to own a chain of elite, five-star restaurant studios, to walk into her most high-profile establishment in simple jeans, a black trench coat that absorbed the rain like a second skin, and her natural curls tucked under a knitted cap. Her presence quiet and unassuming, for she was not there to be recognized or worshipped, but to observe, to test, to see if the standards she demanded in meetings and strategy calls were truly alive in the heartbeat of her business, when her name wasn't known, when her face wasn't announced, when she was, in the eyes of her staff, just another woman walking in from the cold with hopes of being treated with warmth. And as she stepped through the heavy glass doors of Allen Rouge, her most luxurious and architecturally stunning venue, with its marble floors glistening under chandelier light, golden accents on every table, and a curated jazz playlist softly playing in the background, she immediately noticed the flicker of eyes, the subtle up-and-down glances from the host stand, where two employees stood chatting and laughing, barely looking up as she approached, and when they did, the tall, slim motor D, dressed immaculately in black and white with a crimson handkerchief in his pocket, barely concealed his surprise, or perhaps disdain, offering a smirk that didn't reach his eyes as he said flatly, "We don't have walk-in seating tonight." And before she could even respond, his eyes darted back toward the other host, exchanging a look and a chuckle, clearly making assumptions, and yet Aliyah remained calm, composed, her voice smooth and unwavering as she replied, "I have a reservation." Under a Bennett, a name that should have lit up alarms if the man had any sense or curiosity, but instead, he rolled his eyes and leaned sideways, waving toward a nearby waiter who had been half listening to the exchange, a young man with slick back hair and the casual arrogance of someone who believed charm was a substitute for professionalism. And that man, Trevor, sauntered over, glanced at Aliyah dismissively, and muttered, "Sure you do," without so much as checking the list, then leaned in conspiratorially toward the Motor D and whispered something that was loud enough for Aliyah and, unfortunately, several nearby guests to catch. "She probably delivers for DoorDash," followed by a snicker that left a sour echo in the air, as if their prejudice had physical weight, and though a few patrons at the bar chuckled, others turned their heads, some out of curiosity, some discomfort, while Aliyah, unmoved, stepped aside, pulled out her phone not to confront them. Not yet, but to make a few quiet notes, to document the experience, because what she had just witnessed was not just rudeness, but a systemic failure in the very heart of what was supposed to be her flagship for excellence. And as she stood there in the lobby with its rich mahogany paneling and bespoke floral arrangements, she watched how other guests were greeted, how women in heels and designer dresses were ushered in with smiles, how couples were complimented on their perfume or their watch, and how no one else was made to feel like an inconvenience or a threat to image. And with each passing moment, Aliyah's resolve strengthened not in anger, but in purpose, because this was why she walked in without her title, why she refused to be surrounded by yes-men and flattery, why she insisted on knowing what her guests felt when they walked into one of her restaurants, not in a suit, not in a headline, but in the skin of someone easily dismissed. And so she waited as the Motor D laughed again, and finally, with great reluctance, asked her name once more and checked the reservation list, only to blanch when he found a Bennett VIP private table. And yet, instead of apologizing or offering courtesy, he attempted to salvage ego by asking, "Is that really you?" in a tone that dripped with doubt and subtle accusation. And though she could have snapped, could have unleashed her authority then and there, Aliyah merely nodded, offering no satisfaction in her calm, and was finally led to her reserved small but elegant corner table often used by the most high-profile guests. Tucked away near the back wall where privacy and luxury met, and as she was seated, Trevor returned, dropping a menu without eye contact and asking in a tone bordering on mocking, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" And when Aliyah said she'd start with sparkling water and the chef's tasting menu, he gave a theatrical blink and said, "That's a 7-course meal with wine pairings. It's not cheap," followed by another smirk and a quiet "You want to see the regular menu instead?" And Aliyah, still composed, handed him her American Express Centurion card, the iconic black metal card only issued by invitation to the ultra-elite, and when it clinked on the table, Trevor's smirk faltered for a moment before returning with, "Wow, you can get those on eBay now." and he walked away without verifying the payment, without checking if the card was real, and Alaya simply leaned back in her chair, observing how the sommelier skipped her table, how the bread never came, how the entire floor staff avoided eye contact as though her presence was inconvenient. And as the first course finally arrived, late cold, and without explanation, she began composing a message to her general manager, who was off-site for the evening, and to her director of operations, including timestamps, employee names, and specific infractions, not out of vengeance, but because excellence required accountability. And as she sat there with her fork poised above the food she had once celebrated in promotional videos and PR campaigns, she realized something more sobering than the rudeness. The culture had changed, not in a memo or a manual, but in the spaces between service, in the tone, in the unspoken assumptions, in the neglect, and she had no one to blame but herself if she let it continue. And so, quietly, without raising her voice, without calling attention to herself, she documented every detail, knowing that this chapter would not end with a plate, it would end with a reckoning. Trevor continued to strut around the dining floor like it was his personal stage, his every movement laced with performative elegance as he floated between white linen tables and affluent guests, pouring vintage wines with a flourish, bowing slightly to men in tailored suits, offering flirtatious compliments to women in diamond chokers and silk gowns, his voice a melodic hum of insincere charm. Yet when it came to Alaya Bennett seated alone at a corner table that had hosted senators, CEOs, and even royalty, his demeanor curdled into one of thinly veiled condescension. And though she had revealed her reservation under a Bennett, a name that should have sent warning bells to any trained staffer in the hospitality industry, it was clear Trevor had no idea who he was dealing with, for he approached her not with respect but with suspicion, tilting his head and offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes as he asked in a syrupy tone, "You sure you can afford anything on this menu?" A question so patronizing and loud enough that nearby patrons momentarily turned their heads, their eyes flicking between Trevor and Alaya like spectators to an unexpected scene. But Alaya, poised and unshaken, regarded him with a calm stare, one she had perfected over years of boardroom battles and corporate negotiations where being underestimated was routine, and she said evenly, "I'd like to begin with the chef's tasting menu and a bottle of Chateau Margaux 2000, please." Her tone more of a command than a request, yet Trevor laughed, a high-pitched, theatrical sound that rippled across the polished dining room like a cruel wind. "The bottle's over $3,000, he sneered. "You want a Coke instead?" And before she could respond, he had spun around and walked away, dismissing her order as though it were a joke, leaving Alaya sitting in silence as the nearby couple exchanged pitying glances. The woman mouthing, "Unbelievable," while the man simply shook his head. But Alaya, ever composed, reached into her purse and placed her American Express Centurion card, known widely as the black card, on the edge of the table, letting its heavy metal clink softly against the porcelain plate. A sound subtle yet definitive, the kind of sound that commanded attention for those who knew its value. But Trevor, passing by again, scoffed as he glanced at it and said under his breath, "Anyone can get a fake card these days," and walked off to lavish attention on a man in cufflinks seated 3 tables over, pouring him a glass of 1996 Dom Perignon as if baptizing royalty, while back in the kitchen and service station, laughter echoed as Trevor and a few other waitstaff mocked Alaya openly, calling her hood rich, speculating on how she got the card, mocking her coat, her hair, her presence, unaware that the person they ridiculed was not only the legal owner of the very building they worked in, but the executive whose signature authorized their bonuses, their staffing schedules, and whether or not the restaurant would be open tomorrow. And Alaya, listening carefully as voices bounced off the corridor walls and into the dining room, documented each slight, each comment, each missed step, the absence of bread service, the failure to pour water, the lack of a sommelier, the substitution of her wine order with a glass of something clearly cheaper, clearly unauthorized, and clearly meant to insult her intelligence and, rather than call attention to it, rather than demand respect with volume or spectacle, she chose observation, chose strategy, chose justice, and with each moment she constructed a narrative not in anger but in truth, one that would be delivered with precision and finality. For while Trevor continued to perform his pantomime of professionalism for wealthy white patrons, Alaya's silence became sharper, her presence heavier, her documentation thicker, noting every second the staff failed her, every glance that dismissed her, every giggle that betrayed a deeper rot in the restaurant's culture. And when the next course arrived overcooked, unpaired and served without ceremony, it confirmed everything she feared. The excellence she had built was being eroded, not by systems or costs or critics, but by complacency and implicit bias in the very people trusted to uphold her name. And so she emailed the general manager, then the director of operations, then the head of training, detailing her experience in bullet point precision, attaching photos, timestamps, even snippets of overheard conversations, not to create drama but to invoke accountability. Because the next course, the next act, the next confrontation would not be about food, it would be about restoring integrity, about confronting a culture that had grown comfortable with bigotry dressed as banter, about reminding every person in that building that power doesn't always walk in wearing diamonds or designer heels. Sometimes it comes soaked in rain, dressed in denim, and watching from the corner table, silent, steady, and waiting to reclaim its crown. After enduring nearly 2 hours of humiliation that came dressed as fine dining, delayed service, whispered insults, icy glances from servers who seemed to consider her an anomaly rather than a guest, Aliyah Bennett, cloaked in poise and armed with silent fury, finally pushed her chair back with a grace that belied the storm building within, and the moment she rose, as if triggered by some unspoken signal, the motor D came rushing toward her with a performative smile, his voice low and patronizing as he whispered urgently, "Ma'am, we really need this table, please, don't cause a scene," revealing with that single sentence the depth of his assumptions and the shallowness of his character, unaware that he was about to experience a reckoning he would not soon forget. And Aliyah, who had remained seated, observant, collecting every insult and offense like evidence in a trial, now reached calmly into her coat pocket and pulled out a business card embossed in bold, unmistakable gold, its letters catching the chandelier light as she laid it gently atop the white linen tablecloth like a final checkmate move. And as the Motor D leaned in to read it, his eyes widened and his skin visibly drained of color, because staring back at him were the words, "Aliyah Bennett, owner, Elon Dining Group," and in that moment, all the smirks, all the dismissiveness, all the smug superiority collapsed into stunned silence. And just then, as if fate had scripted it for dramatic effect, Trevor sauntered back toward the table carrying a plate, saw the commotion, and said with a smirk, "What, is she refusing to pay now?" Before noticing the card and the set of keys Aliyah now held in her hand, keys that unlocked every door in the restaurant, including the private office upstairs, and, when his eyes locked with hers and he registered the gravity of the situation, the smirk vanished, replaced by a desperate, almost childlike confusion as he muttered, This is a joke, right?" But Aliyah didn't answer right away. She simply turned toward him with a calm that was colder than ice, the kind of calm that precedes judgment, and said in a low, controlled voice, "You've been serving your boss all night, and failing," a sentence that echoed through the stunned silence like thunder in a cathedral. And without another word, she turned from them and walked briskly past the other tables, ignoring the now curious stares of remaining guests, her heels clicking against the marble floor with deliberate intent, heading straight toward the back of house and into the private office, her office, where she summoned the assistant general manager, a sharp and nervous young woman named Kim, who had just arrived for the evening shift and nearly spilled her tablet when she realized who was calling her in. And within 10 minutes, Aliyah had triggered an emergency staff meeting, calling every employee on shift front and back of house into the central service hallway. And she stood before them not as the hidden observer they had mistreated, but as the founder, the architect, the woman whose vision built the very walls surrounding them. And though her voice was calm, it carried with it the weight of disappointment, more potent than rage, and she told them, in a voice as precise as a scalpel, what she had experienced that night, not as an owner, not as a VIP, but as a woman who looked different from what they expected wealth to look like, a black woman walking in alone without pretense or entourage, and how their treatment of her revealed not a failure of hospitality, but a failure of humanity. And she detailed each slight, each moment of disrespect, from the moment she entered to the moment she stood before them now. And the room grew heavy with shame as they realized that their actions had not only violated company policy but had disrespected the very person who had given them their jobs. And then she paused, letting silence build before she continued. "You don't represent excellence," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "You represent entitlement, and entitlement doesn't run my business." And with that, she announced a mandatory retraining for all staff effective immediately, with Trevor and the Motor D suspended pending formal review, and several others warned that their conduct would be evaluated in the days to come, because for Aliyah, this wasn't about punishment, it was about culture, and a culture of exclusion, of judgment based on skin, dress, or assumption, would not be tolerated in any restaurant bearing her name. And as she dismissed the meeting, several employees quietly approached to apologize, some in tears, others ashamed. But Alaya, though gracious, reminded them that apologies mean nothing without change, and as she walked back to her table, she noticed the guests who remained, many of whom had watched the scene unfold, all free nods of respect, one woman even standing to shake her hand and whisper, "Thank you for handling that with such grace." But Alaya knew that grace alone wouldn't fix what had cracked. And as she sat back down at her table, now set properly by Kim herself, with fresh flowers and a complimentary bottle of Chateau Margaux 2000, she took a deep breath, because the real work restoring trust, building back culture, rooting out rot disguised as charm was just beginning, and she would do it not with vengeance, but with vision. By the end of that unforgettable night, after the final wine had been poured and the ambient music softened into a melancholy hum beneath the low murmur of retreating conversations, Alaya stood at the helm of a reckoning long overdue, her quiet authority unraveling the toxic pretense that had masqueraded as luxury for too long. And as Trevor was escorted out, still stammering excuses that fell like ash from a collapsing ego, followed shortly by the stunned Motta D, both of whom were fired on the spot with immediate effect and escorted through the same doors they once guarded with prejudice. It became clear to everyone watching that something far greater than a staffing correction was taking place. This was a transformation, a cleansing, a necessary exorcism of arrogance and quiet bias that had festered beneath polished surfaces. And while most restaurateurs might have swept such a scandal under a Persian rug of PR damage control, did the opposite. She leaned into transparency with unwavering resolve, walking from table to table that night, personally apologizing to each guest who had witnessed the incident, her voice steady but sincere, her eyes unwavering, offering complimentary reservations and honest explanations to ensure no one left with assumptions unanswered. Because this was never just about hurt, it was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or disrespected in spaces they had every right to occupy. And the next day, she didn't simply reprimand the staff or tweak a few policies, she temporarily shut down the entire restaurant, an establishment once heralded by magazines as a jewel of culinary excellence, and launched a full cultural overhaul, bringing in leading diversity consultants, reimagining staff training from the ground up, and most radically implementing a bold new policy that sent waves through the fine dining industry. Every staff member, from hostess to executive chef, would be required to serve incognito customers, anonymous evaluators who might be wearing thrifted jackets or couture blazers, who might arrive solo or in groups, who might be anyone from a regional director to Alaya herself, and whose purpose was not to test knowledge of wine or knife technique, but to measure something: depercris, dignity, presence, and respect. Because Alaya knew from experience that excellence wasn't in the plating, it was in the gaze that met each customer as they walked in, the tone used when a question was asked, the sincerity behind each welcome. And as news of the incident and her powerful response began to circulate, not through gossip rags, but through authentic social media testimony, especially one viral video posted by a diner who had discreetly captured the moment, Alaya revealed her identity, captioned with the hauntingly elegant line, "She walked in invisible. She walked out as the boss." The story exploded across the internet, triggering discussions not just about racism in fine dining, but about the deeper issue of unconscious bias in elite spaces. And as the headlines shifted from scandal to celebration, Alaya's name became synonymous not just with culinary excellence, but with cultural revolution. Her email inbox flooding with speaking requests, interviews, partnerships, and even apologies from other restaurateurs quietly admitting they had similar problems but had lacked the courage to address them. And when the restaurant finally reopened weeks later, it looked the same on the outside, same facade, same grand awnings, but inside, there was a noticeable difference, a warmth that hadn't been there before, a sense of equality and awareness, humming just beneath the surface. And at the front, right near the hostess stand, engraved in brushed brass under soft light, was the new motto Alaya had written herself: "Everyone at this table deserves dignity." A simple but transformative declaration that greeted each guest like a blessing. And on the night of the reopening, Alaya returned it in couture or paparazzi-worthy glamour, but in the same rain-slicked coat and dark jeans she had worn the night of the incident, her hair natural, her presence unassuming. And this time, the moment she entered, every head lifted, not in shock, not in confusion, but in respect, and every server new and returning stood a little taller, their greetings genuine, their gestures humble, not because they feared her, but because they had finally understood the message she had brought with her the first time. But true class isn't in silver spoons or aged scotch, but in how you treat the person sitting alone at the table. And as she dined quietly that evening, sipping a perfectly poured glass of the Chateau Margaux 2000 she had once been denied, several guests approached not to gawk or apologize, but to thank her, to express what her leadership had taught them about identity, power, and presence. And Elia, ever gracious, simply nodded and smiled, knowing that this wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of something deeper, a movement born not from rage, but from radical dignity. And as the last course arrived, a delicate chocolate soufflé named Bennett's Grace, added to the menu by the head chef in her honor, Ria, took one quiet bite and looked around the room, a place she had always owned but had finally transformed into a space worthy of her vision, a place where no one would ever again have to earn their right to be seen.